They tell you when you start to prepare yourself to work for 12 hours. Most of us had come from jobs where we worked 8-hour days, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. I had been an office drone when I found this job in the paper, and it had been an easy choice to switch to a job that would nearly double my take-home pay. I had accrued my share of debt in college, and my student loans were high enough to keep me under the company's thumb until I retired. With the level of pay I was receiving from the prison, however, I could afford to be out of debt in a decade instead of 30 years. Stagview Prison seemed like an escape in those days. In onboarding, they caution you about many things. The inmates, the stress, the workload, and the long hours are always the main bullet points in any presentation. They tell you that you will likely work the night shift for the first 2 years of employment. As a male, they told me that I would probably have to work in the close management dorm, the cell blocks with the rolling doors and the bars on the windows. They told me I would be placed in confinement as a permanent floor officer, where I would have insults and excrement flung at me in equal amounts. They warned us, the fresh-faced TAs who had yet to set foot on the holy ground that was the compound, that we would see things here that we wouldn't see anywhere else. We would be assaulted with ideas and actions that had no place in the outside world. They told us that normal people would look at us and scratch their heads when we tried to tell them that the things they saw on TV weren't the way things actually were. They told us to prepare to be unable to relate to the people who had once been our friends and draw close to the new friends we made while we were on the compound. Above all, they warned us about the strain of our newfound careers. They warned us about the mental stress of day sleeping, sleep deprivation, the long nights that never end. They told us that we would feel the urge to sleep, that we might even find our focus slipping, but that we had to be diligent. We had to be watchful. They told us that we could never take our eyes off them, even for a second, or they would bite like a bad dog. They had selected 2 instructors from the compound for us to learn from. One was a plucky sergeant who worked the religious dorm. I think her name was Dotson. She talked a lot about reform and about inmates turning over new leaves and how it was up to us to provide positive influence, so they knew that there was something outside those walls. The other was a grizzled old warhorse who looked as though he had been carved from the abandoned rock quarry that sat at the edge of the compound. He was tall and gray and seemed uncomfortable in the daylight. He was the one who would tell us, with wide eyes possessed of that 1,000-yard stare, that we must be vigilant and that we must be prepared. He told us about the shifts that last for days. He talked about the shifts that last your whole life. I didn't understand what he meant until that day, until I found my own never-ending 12-hour shift. What happened was a freak accident, which means it had been meticulously planned for weeks. The H-dorm inmates had likely been planning the event, but what happened before it was a perfect shitstorm. We had been experiencing a very aggressive sickness that had put most of the dorms in quarantine. The dorms that were not infected were being used to cook the meals, do the laundry, and go about the other day-to-day activities that needed volunteers. These men, of course, had never been trained to do a lot of these things, so as the food quality decreased and the number of inmates on quarantine increased, an underlying panic seemed to permeate the compound. I'm writing this down so someone will remember it later. I'm writing it down so I might remember it later. If there is a later, I guess. Hour 1. When we were called to Quad 4 of H-dorm, it was to break up a fight. H-dorm was not under quarantine, but the dorm was a melting pot of different gangs, and they were all afraid of the sick people. The fight was already done by the time we arrived, the parties involved having melted into the crowd. We were left to find them, make sure they received the medical attention they needed, and were adequately punished for disrupting the normal flow of the compound. I was accompanied by 2 other officers, each more useless than the last. Officer Fest was a captain's pet, a boot-licking ladder climber who was better at taking naps than being an officer. He was joined by Sergeant Creast, a year-and-a-day man who was more experienced at smoking cigarettes outside the captain's office than running a dorm. When I had been called for assistance, the captain had found them hanging out by his door and directed them to help me. Together, they might have been a complete officer, but just barely. I didn't much care. This was my dorm, and I was gonna have control. The other officers were purely for appearance. I had a reputation for being fair but firm with my dorm, and that level of consistency goes a long way with these guys. I would have walked out onto the floor by myself any other day and gained immediate control of the situation with a few words and command presence. This was a situation that called for more presence than just me, though. So, the three of us left the officer station and went out to put them in their cells and assess the damage. When we arrived, it was clear that the fight was not as over as I had thought. The large group was gathered around a single man. His nose was bloody, and he seemed to be backing himself up against the door of the quad. When we came in, he nearly leapt out into the sally port to get away from the mob. Creast pulled him out, slapping some cuffs on him, and took him away before he could do more than sputter. Fest moved in behind me, popping the seal on his gas as he came through the door. I put out a hand trying to waylay him, but it was already too late. As the group came towards us, I could see the knives coming out, and knew that words were not going to cut it with this bunch. The mob was howling about the man being a carrier, someone with the sickness, and wanted him dead. I reached for my gas, but I was a little too late. The knife slipped into my guts, and I was overcome with the most intense pain of my life. I grabbed my stomach and stumbled back, the mob spilling out the door behind me. They had no real interest in me. They wanted the man that had started the problem. As I leaned up against the glass, I could hear the sirens going off as Hazard, the officer I'd left in the station, saw the carnage and hit the lockdown alarm. My radio exploded with sound, the clarion call of 1024, officer down in quad 4 of H-dorm. I saw the mob as it rolled over poor Fest, the orange spray flying indiscriminately as their knives twinkled in slashing arcs. They would soon hit the door and realize that they were locked in, which would make them very angry. That's when they would finally notice poor wounded me and come looking for keys. In the chaos, I scooted on my butt across the slippery floor. I tried to stand, but my knees were kind of shaky, so I made for an empty cell near the mop closet. I shuffled, my guts a mess of angry snakes, as the men at the back of the mob began to divert and come after me. I dug at my gas with my free hand, sending out an orange stream at the ones who had wandered too close. They stepped back, hissing their displeasure as they gripped their faces and rubbed their eyes, and I stumbled into the cell and slammed the door in their face before they could recover. The slamming door was like a coffin lid slamming shut. This cell would be my shelter for the next 12 hours. This cell would be my hell for the next 12 hours. Hour 2. The sun started to set. I could see it through the grates and the plexiglass that hung over the window. It was filmy, like something seen through water. The strange, undulating waves made the common enough setting of the sun look like a painting in some stoner's gallery. It was as beautiful as it was jarring, and I both hoped for the darkness and feared it. The inmates pressed their faces against the smeary glass and leered at me. They reached their hands through the food flap, but they couldn't get me. I was sprawled against the far wall, my back against the warm stone, and I could see the pool of my own blood that had formed beside me. It hadn't looked too bad, a small puncture in my stomach, but the blood kept flowing as I lay there and held it. I removed my uniform shirt, already stained with dark red, and wrapped it around my stomach like a bandage. I'm not a very big guy. The cheeseburgers haven't quite caught up with me yet, and the shirt made a passable bandage. It stopped the bleeding, for now, but I can still see the blood spreading across the fabric. I'm too much of a coward to inspect the wound, and I don't want to make it worse than it already is. I could hear them outside the door. They're bustling like ants, ever plotting as they make their way and their plans. Every now and again, one of them would look in on me. They would press their face to the glass like a kid at the zoo before losing interest and wandering off again. I watched them back, trying to make note of who came to gawk at me. I would have them then. No more Mr. Nice Guy. I'd see them all on the same block as the guy who stabbed me. My radio crackles frequently. They assembled the response team and prepared to breach the dorm. They were having trouble because after H-dorm, another had decided to descend into chaos. I had seen them outside the window, decked out in their riot gear, weapons at the ready when the radio reported F Dorm was experiencing similar problems. Then D Dorm had followed, their inmates not making it out but trashing the place instead. That's when I saw a bleary line of bodies coming out of F Dorm as someone disengaged the locks on their doors. I watched as the team was moving to Center Gate so they could keep the rioters from breaching the inner ward or getting into the administration area that lay beyond. As they ran for the gate, Control crackled over the walkie to ask if I was 10-4. "Yeah, everything's still 10-4, I returned. "Stay safe, we'll get you out of there." They were right, but their rescue plans were a bit premature. Hour 3. I sat in the dying light and contemplated many things. When we put men in these little cells, we never appreciate how their whole world shrinks. These 4 walls became the borders of my world, and I knew that I was trapped here indefinitely, unless some outside force acted on that door. In my case, this was a good thing. The inmates on the outside would tear me to shreds for the keys on my belt. However, this was likely a very sobering thought for a man lying in this bed at night. He could die in this bed, and no one would notice until morning. You could be locked in here with a dead man till morning, and someone may or may not believe you until they saw the corpse. They kept coming by to gawk at me. In the shadows of the cell, I could see their stretched faces as they wavered behind the glass. I could see their lumpy faces in otherworldly dimensions as they blocked out the light to have a look at me. I was as curious as most of them, but a few of them seemed concerned that I might die. They knew that if I died, they'd be blamed. They knew that if I died, it would add to the time on their sentences. Some of them may even care about my life. It doesn't matter why they come, but they all come to have a peek as they pass their lives in this lockdown. As the time crept closer to 9, a fact I only knew because of the chapel bells that tolled every hour until 10, I began to hear some definite agitation from the world outside. Whoever was in the bubble had turned off the TVs. This may seem like a minor enough inconvenience, but to the inmates, the TV was their only exposure to the world. For many, it was their only joy in life, and the absence of it was very upsetting. To top it off, the unnamed officer had also cut the exhaust fans and the wall-mounted fans. The quad in our old prison was not air-conditioned, something the warden had been fighting to maintain for decades. Without the fan to push air and the exhaust fans to pull the hot air out, it would soon become stifling on the wing. Outside, I could hear the sounds of men yelling, things being thrown, and the sounds of their hellish revelry. I wondered briefly how many other officers were in a similar situation. How many were trapped in a cell, trapped in their officer station, their worlds confined to a box now. For inmates, this may seem normal by now, but to me, a man accustomed to moving about the wide world, it was torture. The men out on the yard, men who were now seeing their worlds grow larger by the minute, were freer now than I. The realization made me feel even more claustrophobic than before. The radio only seemed to make my anxiety worse. The mob had taken over the yard and was now trying to break into one of the quarantine dorms. The special response team was on the scene, but the riot quickly spilled out of control. I could hear gunfire out there and knew there would be a few empty beds come morning. That would be on both sides, I had no doubt. Once they started rioting, it was hard to get them to stop. A few could be put down earlier on, but once the rioters had gotten this far, it would be hard to quiet them with that extreme violence. The radio was silent on my end, no one asking for an update on my situation. I told them all I was 10-4 just so they didn't forget about me, but the growing red stain on my shirt made me think otherwise. Hour 4. As the bell in the chapel tolled 9, the negotiator approached the flap. I was surprised that it had taken him this long to seek me out. In every situation like this, there's always one person who believes they can talk someone out of their stance. Maybe it's a hostage negotiator, a kidnapper trying to keep his charges quiet, an unwilling participant who thinks they can talk their captor out of this foolish act. There's always one person who thinks they can change the situation with a few well-placed words. A few times, I've been that person, the designated talker who tries to de-escalate the situation. When he smiled at me through the glass, I knew why he was there. "We got off on the wrong foot, Sarge. Can we talk?" I was leaning against the wall, head pounding as my wound ached. I turned my sweat-soaked face to him and saw some of his resolve slip. I must have looked a fright. Untreated stab wounds don't tend to make you look fresh, though. "You want these keys," I rasped, getting straight to the point. He nodded, trying to reset his face as he got a good look at me. "There's no way in hell I'm going to give you these keys. You might as well save your breath. And mine." He shook his head like a father who's disappointed with a stubborn child. "Be reasonable, Sarge. There's no one up in the station anymore. You've been abandoned, just like us. We might as well help each other out." Thought about it for a minute. Other than the team assembled and moving, I'd seen no attempts to rescue me. My bleeding wasn't getting any worse, but it wasn't getting any better either. Without medical attention, I wasn't going to last long. I was also without food or water in here. I had nothing besides the water in the sink, or the toilet, and who knew what kind of infection I was putting myself at risk to as I lay on the floor and bled from an unbandaged wound. If I could get out of here, I could use my keys in the medical room at the end of the hall and clean and bandage my wound. If I could get out of here, I could surely find a way to the relative safety of the officer station. Maybe it would be best to make a deal. As though to disprove his words, the lights in the cells came on. The harsh fluorescence made me squint as they popped to life, but I smiled despite the discomfort. Those lights had to be turned on by a person. That meant that there was still someone in the station. The negotiator seemed to realize this too, as I grinned my grisly grin in the face of his obvious defeat. "Go back and tell your friends it's not gonna happen. If you all want these keys, you can figure out how to come in and get them." He shook his head, but to his credit, he didn't lose his cool. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Sarge," was all he said, before finally leaving me to my throbbing stab wound. Hour 5. My radio began to chirp. That was the sound that meant the battery was getting ready to die. The batteries are supposed to have an 8-hour charge, but realistically, you're lucky to get 3 or 4 in before you need to change it. The beeps mean that, with limited use, you had about an hour of battery left. As I lay on the floor in pain, I felt like the little radio might be chirping my life away. It had chosen the perfect time to die, too. The riot was not going well for the prison staff. They were holding Center Gate, but there were likely more inmates than ammunition. I could hear other officers on the radio that were trapped in their stations, trying to figure out what was going on. The inmates of Stragview had taken the inner ward. I didn't need the radio to see that one of the dorms was on fire. One of the dorms on the quarantine had been set ablaze, and with no one to put it out, it was unlikely that the inmates inside would survive. I hoped G-dorm was still secure. G-dorm held the inmates who had been talking the loudest about hurting the quarantine inmates. They had found themselves locked up for the last few weeks for attempting to incite a riot, but it appeared that the riot had come off anyway. If they were allowed to escape confinement, it could get a whole lot worse. The sounds of gunfire were few and far between, and as the riot began to settle in, I started getting sleepy. I know that sounds strange, but as I sat on the dirty floor of that cell, I was getting tired. I lifted a hand, the motion stiff and painful, and slapped my face as hard as I could. I'd lost too much blood to fall asleep. If I fell asleep, I might never wake up again. My mouth felt like it was full of cotton. My tongue stuck to the roof of it. I dragged myself gingerly over to the sink and depressed the silver button that made the water spray out. It arced into the bowl, and I held my hands out eagerly for it. It was cold against my warm skin, and I sloshed it into my mouth eagerly. I collapsed against the floor then, panting. The act of shimmying across the floor and taking a drink had taken a toll on me. I splashed some of the cold water on my face, trying to wake myself up, and also trying to quell the heat that had recently sprung up in me. I was sick, feeling the first pangs of infection, but there was nothing to be done for it. The radio crackled to life suddenly, the operator calling out to me for an update. I reached for the radio, my fingertips slapping it dumbly as I slid it over the floor. I caught it before it fell and pulled it to my mouth with an uneasy hand. The radio felt like it weighed about 30 pounds, and when I depressed the button, I thought it might slip out of my hands for a minute. I told Control that I copied, and started to tell them that I was fine, but never got the chance. The radio beeped loudly, and the face went blank. I dropped it to the concrete, the box now useless. It was dead. Hour 6. It was getting hard to stay awake. My guts felt like I needed to crap, but all that came out was a lot of foul-smelling air. My vision was getting fuzzy. I've been here for 6 hours, and I only know that little fact because the inmates yelled at another inmate that it was 11 o'clock, so he needed to shut the hell up. I'm still leaning against the wall, arms propped on the toilet, cheeks pressed against the cold steel of the sink. I think my wound may have reopened when I drug myself over here. I can see it starting to stain the shirt again, the red growing and soaking into the gray as it spreads my lifeblood across the fabric. These notes may be my final statement to the world. I don't believe they have forgotten about me. I believe I may be less of a priority to them than other objectives, though. I can hear scattered gunfire outside, but it doesn't seem to be coming any closer. Someone is shouting through a megaphone, but I can barely make it out. The way the echoes bounce things around in here, it's a wonder anyone can hear anything. As I sit here writing, I'm looking at the wall across from me, and I think my fever might be getting higher than I thought it was. The concrete wall, a wall I know to be solid, keeps rolling like waves on the ocean. I could almost believe that if I were to stick my hand out, I would feel the waves as they roll along. The effect of watching the wall roll like a high tide is dizzying. I wonder if this is why inmates in confinement always seem so squirrely. Do they see this kind of thing so often that they eventually start to believe it's true? I know that the wall is solid, but at the same time, I know what I can see with my own eyes. Am I going crazy? Or is this just the fever? I can't really be sure. Hour 7. I'm lying on the cold concrete floor, watching the most interesting spider. He's built his web under the bed and has somehow avoided getting it destroyed. I see him watching me as I watch him. We seem to be as interested in each other as the other is. Cold concrete feels good on my hot face, and as I write this, I can feel my hands getting heavier and heavier. I can see someone pointing at me through the window. They're talking to someone else, but I can't hear them over the pounding in my ears. I can't remember if that's normal or not. It feels like I've been back here for days. This notebook tells me it's only been 7 hours, but it feels like a lot longer. As I'm writing this, a roach has blundered his way into the spider's web. Mr. Spider has begun the process of eating his dinner, and I watch the shiny brown body disappearing into the white coat. The roach struggles against the inevitable, but as he disappears into his new cell, he gets still. Will I grow still too at the end, I wonder? It's quieting down out there. Most of them are going to bed. I can hear them closing their cell doors and settling in. The smart ones are closing their doors, at least. Leaving your door open is a great way to get shot when the National Guard finally gets here. Going to bed sounds like a great idea, actually. I know I shouldn't, but I can barely keep hour, question mark. I don't know what time it is. The ceiling is spinning like a top as I lay here and look at it. I don't know why I'm still writing. My hand moves on its own, it seems. I feel like I'm floating. My stomach throbs in time with my heartbeat. Something is going on outside. I can hear people yelling. Their voices sound so stupid and fragile. They sound like toy soldiers stuck in the mud. The ceiling keeps changing colors as it swirls. It looks like a blacklight poster I saw once in my friend's room. It shifts through the colors as the spiral continues to spin. I can see a light starting to form in the middle of it. I wipe sweat off my forehead. I can feel the flesh against the back of my hand, and I don't like it. It's much, much too warm. Things are making banging noises outside the window. I can hear boots stomping around inside and outside. People are shouting. I don't know what's going on. I'm scared. I want to go home. Hour 10. I wake up to the sound of banging on my door and chimes from the tower signaling chow time. I manage to sit up and make my eyes focus long enough to see that it was the negotiator from earlier. He doesn't look so sure of himself now. There's a big bruise on his cheek, and he looks pretty scared. He keeps swimming in and out of focus, but I don't think that's anything he's doing on purpose. "Sarge," he yells, trying to get my attention. "We need to get out of here. Please give us the keys, and we'll get you some help." I can't muster the focus to speak to him. I manage to flop back to my spot between the toilet and the sink and run some water into my hand. The cool water feels nice, but it's doing nothing to cool me off. I can feel myself sliding sideways again, but the guy yells at me and forces me to come back to some kind of groggy reality. "Sarge, please, you're not going to last much longer. You're the only bargaining chip we have left. Please, we can get you out of here. We can get you some help." I lean against the wall again, blocking him out. I'm not even sure how I'm still writing at this point. I'm tired. I think I'll stop for a while. Hour 11. Someone's out there rolling doors open. I can hear them loud as thunder as they crash open in their metal tracks. People are yelling, but it's all very strange. I'm having trouble feeling my fingers. My arms feel real heavy. My breathing feels watery and my chest feels kind of thick. I think I might be dying, but that's probably wishful thinking. There's no face at my door, but that doesn't mean anything. Maybe they're figuring out how to get into the booth. Maybe they have keys. Who can know? I can hear someone outside the doors, voices raised in anger, and I'm afraid now that they might have figured out how to get in. The door close to mine just slid open with a sound like a landslide. If they come in here, they'll kill me. That may not be such a bad thing, though. My notebook is lying on my lap, and the writing I can see appearing on the page is nearly illegible. I can see the original pool of blood I left. Hello, pool of blood. It's dark red and flaky, but the red streaks I left earlier are still a little wet looking. I can feel my pants. They're tacky with my blood and sticking to me with my pee. I'm surprised I'm still conscious, honestly. Another door rolls open, the one right next to my cell. I can hear someone next door screaming, and the sound of a gun as it crashes in the quiet dorm. A gun? Did the inmates get their hands on some guns? Why would they start killing each other? That's a stupid question. Why do inmates do anything? Well, if they have a gun, at least it'll be quick. There's a bright light on my face. My door is rolling open. I hope it's quick. Hour 12. That's a lie. It's really been about 3 days, but it might as well have been 12 hours. A lot has happened in those 3 days. The men at the door turned out to be the recovery team. While I was hovering on the edge of life, they breached the quad through the fire door and rolled in on the disoriented inmates. I've been told casualties were limited, but I heard someone get shot next door, so who knows? My wound was bad. The knife had pierced something important, and that something had started leaking into my sternum. I had continued bleeding, thanks to the leakage, and the doctor said that if I hadn't been saved, I would likely have died in a few more hours. I had been flushed out, patched up, given antibiotics, and will likely make a full recovery. The warden himself came down to speak with me. He's an odd guy. I only met him a handful of times, and it's always weird to see him outside the prison. He offered to shake my hand, but I made a half-hearted show of it. He seemed very intent on my story, asking me to recount my experiences for him, as he regarded me with those far too curious eyes. I could swear they gleamed from behind those little glasses he wears, and I told him that I'd lived through it. The prison will, of course, cover my medical bills, and the warden has offered me a commendation for bravery. Bravery. All I did was survive. I didn't tell him about the notes I had. I wanted to keep them so I could see if they matched my memories. The cramped, scrabbly handwriting is just barely legible, and it reads more like the writings of a madman. I'll probably post it along with this story just in case you'd like to read my half-mad ravings. You're probably curious to know why you're reading this at all. The story contains no monsters, no supernatural things, no killers, or anyone other than the guy that tried to stab me, I guess. The story contains a different sort of horror, though. When you're trapped behind the door, your blood running out, you begin to feel that your life is on a stopwatch. It's a sobering feeling, knowing your time is limited. Just because I made it out doesn't mean they all do. So if you decide to go behind the fence, make sure you're ready for whatever those 12 hours have in store for you. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. Well, that's another interesting look at Stragview. But don't worry, it certainly won't be our last. Longtime listeners may remember the riot in question from this story, and if you go back and read The Kindness, you'll know that the stories actually intertwine at a certain point. Regardless, I do hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it and you haven't already subscribed, why not hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that bell so you don't miss any of the spooky stuff we do here. I have a weekly poll for my Friday story, so if you'd like to vote on what you'd like to hear next Friday, come on down and have a look. I always value your input. Let's go ahead and thank our patrons. A special thanks to the Irish Devil for joining our Spooky Skeleton tier contributions, and Janet for also being one of our Spooky Skeletons. Thanks to Xaronana, Emily Coltsfoot, and Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors, and thanks to Glen Jenkins for being our Ghostwriter tier contributor. Thanks everyone, we just couldn't do the show without you. If you too would like to support the show, I always recommend you come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I do. You also get your spooky on a Thursday and a Tuesday, and you get to interact with us on the site and have a lot of fun with the community. There are things on my Patreon that you'll only see there, so come on down and have a look. If you'd like a copy of my latest book, Sleepless Hours, I've left a link below. And if you'd like a signed copy, reach out and I'll be more than happy to send you one, for a price, of course. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.